Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who obviously has been the greatest living philosopher before me. So in this video, I would like to talk about the copyright and intellectual property, as you probably already figured from the title of this video. Okay, so you've probably heard that recently the officials in the European Union have passed on some law about, strengthening the restrictions in terms of copyright and intellectual property in the internet especially. It's a huge, pain in the ass and so on and so forth. So that's why, well, at least that was one of the reasons why I decided to talk about it now. So, with regards to this whole topic of, copyright, etc., I'll just get straight to the point. So I would just make a strong claim that I believe that what is usually called copyright is not really a right even, but it's rather a privilege, a monopolistic privilege. And what is usually called the intellectual property is not even a property. It's more like, some social construct, if you like, some, wicked phantom. Let's examine those statements I've just made. So why do I say that the copyright is not a right, but rather a privilege, a monopolistic privilege again? Well, mostly it's because I believe there are only what is called negative rights. These are the rights that I support personally. And what are the negative rights? Well, those are the rights that you have in the sense that like the other person is not permitted to do something towards you, right? That's the negative right. Like the other person cannot kill you, cannot steal from you, and so on and so forth, cannot have sex with you if you don't want it, and so on. So those are negative rights, okay? And I believe those are genuine rights. Those are the rights you should have in any kind of civilized society. But there are also positive rights, okay? Like the right to be fed, the right to have a decent education, the right to have sex again. Well, I don't know why it kind of keeps floating up, so to speak. Well, maybe I have an idea. But anyway, and so I believe that what is called the copyright is exactly one of those positive rights, okay? And but I believe that, again, these positive rights, they are not rights, actually. They're privileges. Like, and I think it's because I think this is the case because in case of negative rights, what you need is other person not doing something, right? They might do whatever they want, but they cannot invade in your space. They cannot influence your life in some way that you wouldn't like them to, okay? But in case of positive rights, it's actually the enforcement of something onto them, okay? So like, let's take the example of food, for example. Like if you're talking about the right to be fed, what it really means is that you have a privilege for other person to be producing food for you, like just as an obligation. Like the other person is obliged to provide food for you, whereas you can just be sitting on your ass and doing nothing. And is it a good, like, ethical position? I wouldn't say so. Like, I really believe that there is no right to force anything onto anyone, except, like, again, in the case of negative rights, when they directly, like, invade your life and they directly negatively impact your life. And so on, which again I believe is the genuine case of rights, and it's I think it's well, like, again, let's return to this example with food. Like, food does not just fall from sky. Somebody should work to produce it. Therefore, and by the way, we'll return to that point a little bit later. I mean, the fact that it doesn't fall from the sky, but therefore, in order for you to be fed, for your positive rights to be fed, to be satisfied, somebody should enforce the other person to work towards this end, So, if you kind of think this logic through far enough, you would come to slavery or something to that effect. Or socialism, which is the same, I would say. Like, basically, people would have to do something for other people, and these other people might just not do anything, right? Because they have all these infinite positive rights to be fed, to be, to have education, to have sex, to have good cars, to have housing, and so on and so forth. And the list just continues infinitely. I mean, if you let it to be that way, if you let socialists into power, right? And effectively, that would make all the people slaves, because they would work for this anonymous other guy who would receive all that. And this anonymous other guy, whatever he's doing, would work towards them, and it would just become a terrible mess of slavery where everyone is a slave, and so on and so forth. But okay, that's, I mean, I'm kind of digressing here. Okay, I guess I made my point about these negative and positive rights. But yeah, and I think you can call it a political position, right? So what I'm talking about when I believe in negative rights but don't believe in positive rights, it's really a political statement, right? It's not a philosophical statement, because like, philosophically speaking, those two statements are equivalent, right? There's no right or wrong between them. Like, you can choose one or the other, and I choose the statement that the negative rights are genuine rights and positive rights are just privileges. Okay, but a socialist would definitely do the other thing, right? He would say, well, no, the positive rights are the genuine thing, therefore, you should work for anonymous dude at your own expense, and so on. And none of these two positions can be really justified. It's really just a personal choice, a personal preference based on your, ethical position, and so on your, upbringing, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm making a political statement here, I guess. Okay, so, but you might say, well, all right, but isn't the copyright actually the negative right? Okay, so when we're talking about the copyright, it's obviously, all these cases when somebody kind of stole intellectual property from somebody else, like they've reproduced they've copied their piece of music or piece of their painting, their picture, their way of doing things, like the patent law and so on and so forth, or medication is obviously a big thing. And I wouldn't say so, It doesn't really look like stealing to me. And to figure it out, we have to kind of return to the second point I've made, that the intellectual property is not really a property, and therefore it cannot be stolen. So what I mean by that, why do I say it? I think that, well, let's just kind of go back, like really, really far back, and try to figure out what is the basis of the concept of property in the first place, okay? And I promise you it'd be really simple. It's not like this, Marxist shit. It's going to be really simple and very schematic. Like, imagine that I I have an apple. That's a really simple example, right? I can eat an apple, and what happens next is that nobody else can eat that apple, right? And the reason for that is because, well, it was only one apple. And what I mean by that is that resources are limited, okay? That's a very simple economic statement. It's like almost at the foundation of any economic theory. But of course, you can go on and try to deconstruct it, and that would be a pretty interesting philosophical, prospect of research. But I wouldn't do that. I would just settle with the simple fact that resources are limited, and if I eat an apple, you cannot eat it afterwards, and vice versa, right? So therefore, we should probably kind of determine, in order to behave in a civilized manner, we should like set the boundaries. Who can eat this apple, right? And that's what the property is. That's what the property rights are. It's their precondition is the fact of the limited resources, and their consequence is the necessity of determining who is going to be, reaping the harvest of these resources, so to speak. So if this apple belongs to me, I can eat it. If it belongs to you, you can eat it. Or you can, trade it, or you can give it to me as a gift, or whatever, But this is the foundation of property rights, in my opinion, at least. Or, well, the same thing applies to anything, really. But let's think about, like, an apple is a physical object, right? It's a really tangible thing. You can... and it's really limited. But let's think about the intellectual property. Is it limited? That's the main question, because again, the precondition for the existence of property is the fact that resources are limited. But are the intellectual resources limited? That's a good question. And I believe they're not. And in fact, like, if you like take any example of what is currently considered to be an intellectual property, like a piece of art, like, a piece of music, like a song, or a painting, or an idea, or a shape, like geometric shape, or an invention, like super new engine, or whatever. Just take any of these, and you would see that I don't mean the engine itself. I mean like the engineering kind of concept of the engine, right? And you would see that any of those are actually not limited. They might be infinitely copied and spread out, and like. And they actually would become better rather than worse, because an eaten apple is no longer an apple. Like its value is 0 or about so. Whereas the song that one person knows, if it's transferred to another person and another person knows the song actually becomes better rather than worse. Like if many people know this song, it's like, wow, super. That's exactly what we want. So if like you say some guy invented a drug that cures cancer, like if all the laboratories all across the world would know about that and would know how to produce this drug, that would be just awesome, right? It's not that this idea became worse. It actually multiplicated, it's like this whole avalanche through the whole culture occurred. So therefore, I believe what is usually called the intellectual property is just BS. It's just not existent. It shouldn't be there, so that's why I think that the whole copyright, intellectual property, it should be abolished. We don't really need that. It actually hinders the development of society. Like, you know, all these patents that just are sitting somewhere out there, all these drugs that we actually know how to produce, but they are, you know, all these patents are held by these huge corporations that, you know, pay the legislators to pass on these laws that forbid other people of using them. That's just ripping off, you know. It's just, and like hundreds of thousands of people die each year because of that. Is it good? No, I don't think so. Well, one of the points you can probably make against that is that, well, you know, if you abolish the copyright, if you abolish the intellectual property, then people would just not do anything anymore, right? Because this is one of the incentives to do stuff, is to receive these royalties or whatever. Well, I would disagree here, because first of all, like, copyright and patent law, they're not that old. They're only like, the copyright is only about 300 years old, and the patent law is about 200 years old, or about so. But people did stuff before, like, you know, and again, like, if we're talking about art, for example, like some Leonardo, he didn't care about copyright, right? Like Mona Lisa, like, did anybody try to stole his right on this painting? No, nobody did. Even though it wasn't protected by copyright, just everybody knew that it was Leonardo, and that's it, pretty much, right? So you cannot, like, you don't need the support of armed men, you know, the police and the courts and the so on, to protect your right to something. Right in the sense of, like, it being associated with you as its producer, right? It's just like, it's in our human nature, I guess, to recognize the people who actually put their work in what we're using. Not always, because, well, obviously it kind of becomes kind of, I don't know, blurred out, you know, as time goes on. Like, I'm pretty sure that you're not aware of the people who made your computer possible, like the people who developed transistors, like, you know, I don't know, like semiconductor, whatever. You know, there's a huge bunch of people have worked on that. Okay, but anyway, so my point here is that people would still do stuff because that's what people do, right? They want to do something useful. And even more than that, like, today we have much more instruments to spread our creations out, like, and we even have more possibilities for financing this stuff. Like, we have, you know, crowdfunding. Like, if you're gonna tell somebody, well, you know, my laboratory actually kind of is working on this project of developing the drug against, well, okay, let it be cancer. Don't you think people would pay for that, like, just voluntarily? I think they would. Or if they wouldn't, then maybe it's actually something not really useful that you're doing, and you should think about it also. Okay? But obviously, if you have support of, you know, lobbyists, huge corporations, and you know, the police and the courts and the army, then you can do whatever you want because the taxpayer pays for it, right? But that's okay. That's a whole other rabbit hole. So yeah, I would say that the current state of things is really detrimental for the development of both our culture and our even society in general. Like, again, all these cases of medical stuff being patented and therefore not available for the majority, or being, you know, super expensive and therefore not available, and making these people super rich and the other people suffer. That's exactly why I'm saying that it's a monopolistic privilege. It's not a right, you know, the copyright, the intellectual property. It's really BS, if you ask me. Or all these patents in engineering and so on and so forth. Like people blame Google and Facebook and whatnot for them being too monopolistic. Well, guess what? It's because the governments allow them to do that. It's because they're using the government and all these patent systems to just prevent smaller companies to go into play and to, you know, use all these sophisticated instruments that we've developed in recent years, just because, again, they have the support, they have big money, and they can pay all these legislators to pass on these laws that would support them even more. They can pay lawyers to, you know, ensure that all the patents would be theirs, and it's just a horrible mess, I would say. And people blame capitalism for that. That's just great. Whereas anything that government enforces is not capitalism. It's not free market. It's actually, and it's actually, you know, again, I would say that. Okay, let's return a little bit back. So I've said that it's a monopolistic privilege, you know, the copyright and intellectual property. And I would say that the government is the only thing that ensures that this is the case. As well as the government is the only reason we have monopolies in the first place. You don't have monopolies on the free market. It's an absolute fairy tale, because whenever you have a monopoly, which means that it probably kind of overblows its prices, and the quality of its services or goods is not very good, not very high, then anyone else can come up with cheaper products and of better quality, and everybody would buy that guy products, right? Unless you have a government on top of it all that ensures that this big guy gets all the consumers through copyright, through ecological restrictions. I'm talking about oil industry, for example, where all these smaller companies are just getting destroyed because of that. So all these huge giants prosper and so on. So, and it's really it's really funny that even some socialists actually act against the copyright, right? Especially like one interesting case was in you know, all these scientific journals that take like huge fees for subscriptions. Like it's really ridiculous that there's so much, like such a huge money out there. There's a really interesting case with this resource sci-hub that is created by this girl, Alexandra Elbakyan, from Kazakhstan, who is a socialist. And we actually had an argument with her like a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago or about so. And I was kind of trying to put an argument from, you know, free market perspective, and she was just so egoistic, I don't know, kind of egocentric, and she didn't even realize what I was talking about, and she just banned me on her you know, group in one of the social networks, so that I wouldn't, you know, spread the apocalyptic, evil, devilish propaganda of free market and so on. But it's really interesting that these socialists are against the copyright, and whereas, you know, like the irony of the situation is that socialists are actually they want the government to solve all these problems, you know. It's actually socialists who impose all these positive rights including the copyright, you know. I mean, the copyright is one of the positive rights. Free market is only about negative rights. So it's really funny. I guess the socialists just can see that their means to their end, like whatever they want to achieve, are exactly the source of all our problems, you know, the government. And that's where this whole thing, socialism was never tried, comes from, because they're saying, well, okay, this government is bad because it has a lot of regulations and they're bad. But if we only could have established a good government that would also have many regulations, but they would be a good regulations, you know. This is exactly like this archetypal idea that if only I was a Stalin, you know, this idea that Jordan Peterson mentions a lot, for example. Well, okay, I think I kind of rambled enough for today. So again, like just to wrap up, let me repeat my points. I believe that what is called the copyright is not really a right, but it's rather a monopolistic privilege. What is called the intellectual property, it's not really a property, because real property arises when you have a limited amount of stuff. And in intellectual world, you have unlimited amount of stuff, and it actually becomes better the more it spreads out, and the more society prospers, the more it spreads out. So I believe both copyright and the whole concept of intellectual property is detrimental to our development as a society, and I'm pretty damn sure that we should get rid of them. But again, as I've stated before, it's my it's my political position, because as a philosopher, I understand that a completely opposite position is also justified, just, you know, using the other moral ground, so to speak. So it's really a political choice, whether you are with me or against me or whatever you like to be. All right. So I hope you enjoyed this video. You know, the cow does moo, the cat does meow. And what do the eons are doing? They're closing.